Good. All right. So we're heading in to our last of the as yet intractable dilemmas. We talked about the curse of familiar, EdTech-Matthew effect, the trap of routine assessment, and today the toxic power of data and experiment. Let's do this as an exercise. Grab one other person. Your goal is to make a list as long as possible. What is all the data that MIT has about you? If you could go through every server that is somehow even tangentially under the control of MIT, what are all the different types and sources and nature and example of data that MIT has about you? Does that make sense? Make the list as long as you can, as fast as you can. Ready, go. All right, let's start aggregating some big categories of things.
Financial information.
Okay, so they have a lot of financial information. Maybe just like, what are a few examples of some of the most maybe sensitive or personal parts of that? They know your parents' income.
They know your income.
Your income.
They know your bank account.
Bank account. They know your bank account number, or like you give them literally, but they don't like have a screenshot of your like current savings. All right. So they know a lot of financial things about you. What are some other categories?
Health.
What are some sensitive things in there?
History.
History,
Vaccination.
vaccinations, prescriptions, allergies, mental health visits, insurance,
You can also tell if people are LGBT from their medical records.
sexual orientation, activity. Okay, what else you got?
Like personal information, so just like your name,
Yeah, let's call it registrar information.
social security.
Name,
Yeah,
address,
social security
SSN, phone, act.
Oh, they
true.
might have their travel data.
Yeah, if you necessarily your travels.
You have to
You
register.
register at like
your
their
travel.
stuff.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
Like MIT knows where I fit.
Yeah, especially if you've been international, if you do it through the school, you have to register.
Or if you're going to like a country that they have like warnings for, you have to be like, I was there.
Wow.
Yeah.
What else we got?
Academic records.
Good. That's part of it. Academic records. What would that include these days? They know your grades. What else?
Registrations, like what classes you signed up for.
Registration,
Test scores.
test scores,
Major.
every
Attendance.
click ever in Canada, attendance. Yeah. Academic records is a good example of one for in which the granularity of data over the last 10 years has transformed dramatically. Like if we had this discussion in 1980, they would have been like, I guess they know what my grades were and what classes I signed up for. But the volume of data about every activity that you've ever taken online in any of your classes is substantially higher than it used to be. Those records might not be maintained forever. Maybe all those sites get deleted every 18 months or something like that. But some of them might be kept for longer for research or other things like that. All right, other categories.
Residential.
Yeah.
Home and current.
Let's make it even bigger. Let's say location. So they know your residence. Home and campus. Track your devices on Wi-Fi. Card swipes in buildings. So essentially, as you move around campus, it is somewhere there are databases that record all of those activities. How long they maintain those materials, we don't necessarily know. But I mean, I'm sure they'd tell us if we asked. But what else they got?
From that location, they can also tell like who you hang out with.
Yeah, I just learned about this today. What's the system of where you add
Guest
people?
list.
Okay, so I guess if you live in a residence, you create a guest list. of people that are allowed to visit you, like that's like you can just reconstitute the entire social network of MIT from the get list, you know. Yeah, there's all kinds of things you could learn from that.
It's like extracurricular activities, so they know what sports teams and like athletics, like stats on that, and then if you signed up for like club teams or just clubs.
Would be all those kinds of things.
Oh, like PE as well.
Yeah, your gym membership, swipes, activity.
Political affiliations?
How would they get your political affiliation?
Through your extracurriculars, like if you're involved with the recent stuff that's been going on campus.
Yeah, or yeah, good. So there are increasingly presumably lists of people who are affiliated with pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli, any of those other kinds of things. But also people would have just been able to tell before, if you remember. I don't know. I assume there's a Democrat and Republican club at MIT. I would imagine. Someone somewhere.
Emails?
Yes, they have the entirety of your email record.
Even like broader, just like online activity, because like then you have like emails, websites, anything you've registered for.
Yeah, they also offer like a VPN. So like, it's secure to everyone but like MIT.
You also have your like Google Drive. If you sign up for the MIT Google Drive, they have all your documents.
Drive. Yeah, I had a congressional committee that wanted to find out more about my work, not necessarily in a generous way, this past year, and the Office of General Counsel did like a whole search throughout my email to find terms that this congressional committee was interested in learning more about, and we were going back and forth, and I was sort of like, what do you need from me? And they were like, well, it's better if you help us with this, but like either way, we're going to do it. Yeah, all the records that you generate, and that's a good example of how even like, I'm reasonably confident that in most circumstances, like MIT is not going through my email every day and like what's Justin up to, like they don't care. But simply having those records allows all kinds of things to happen with those records. Do you guys have automated laundry machines?
Yeah.
Washing frequency.
It's like an app.
Oh.
Yeah, it's even an app. Like
it's an app. Like you pay for your machine and
you
you
have to
start
sign
it.
up through your MIT email.
Yeah, you have to do it through MIT.
Yeah, and so that I think also raises some questions of like, it's possible actually that MIT doesn't have your laundry data, but that MIT just somehow mandates that a third party has all of your laundry data, which again, like.
You have like keys to your room if you live on campus.
Yeah.
Like physically.
Yeah. Keys. What's good about them having keys?
You get locked out.
Yeah. So I mean, like if there's a day that you're locked out of your room, you're gonna be like, it is so great that MIT knows exactly what key goes in my door and can make another one of those.
They had like room inspections a few weeks ago where they went into every person's room to check if they were abiding by the rules.
Yeah, good. What might be good about room inspections for everyone?
I think.
Yeah, safety.
Yes.
Like if your neighbors are like having halogen lamps that can catch on fire and stuff like that, like you would be glad that they knew about that. But obviously, also seems like a huge invasion of your privacy.
Yeah, I would say like what also like kind of like made the room inspections like good, like better than like is also like you're trusting MIT to be responsible with it. So like they told everyone ahead of time, and they made sure that it's like a visual inspection only, so they're not going through your stuff. But like obviously that's not a thing for a lot of colleges. A lot of colleges could just like come barge into your room and look at anything.
Yeah, so institutions make choices about how So I mean, hopefully, I don't know what kind of feelings do you have when you start looking at this completed list?
There's some more I think. The one that like I've been thinking about lately, given like the affirmative action stuff, is just general demographics once you're on campus, and also something that was not mentioned in financial is like purchase history. So like if you buy anything on campus,
They know you got sushi today.
yeah, like Tito and like all like the coffee stores, like in like Dunkin', the ones in like Forbes, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, particularly if those things somehow go, like, can you put money on your ID card
Yeah,
and
it's
spend
like
directly to your
yeah.
ID card? So, you know, there's, I mean, like two units that we should be thinking about anytime we think about school data is that schools have a bunch of data, and then schools authorize third parties to get a bunch of data, and sometimes only the third party has access, sometimes both parties have access, like both Canvas and MIT people have access to all of your Canvas data. You know, the laundry app might be a good example of, if somebody told me that the maintenance department had access to all the laundry data, or IT, I wouldn't be surprised. But if they were like, yeah, no, we make you sign up with an email, but you know, only the laundry people know your laundry data, that wouldn't surprise me either. But those are sort of two useful, salient categories that will come up as we keep talking about things.
Your deliveries too.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Daily
Very
deliveries.
Because things go through the mailroom?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they have they like store all of your information and your deliveries into like a tracker system, and then they send you emails when your delivery is coming if you didn't pick it up.
Good, yeah, and so there's, you know, typically the data is exchanged for some kind of service. You like want to know when your new headphones are coming or something like that, and so you're glad that they have that. But in order for them to be able to know when your new headphones are coming and to do other kinds of things with it, you know, I mean, the other thing, it's like, you say like, you know, over the past 10 years, was it a good idea for MIT to track the changing volume of deliveries to individual students? Like, yes. I'm sure MIT has had to build all kinds of infrastructure to make it possible for you all to get your stuff in a sensible way. And it's probably a good idea that MIT has data about aggregate, you know, particularly in the aggregate. It's probably a good idea to know, like, oh, you know, in 2014, the typical student got, you know, 2.3 packages a year, and now they get 30.6 packages per year, and, you know, like, just requires a whole different infrastructure to support those two kinds of ways of people doing commerce. Anyway, what other feelings do you have as you look at like the whole list of data that MIT might have about you?
I feel like ultimately I'm not really that surprised. I feel like we kind of grew up in a generation where like digital data has been collected for our entire lives. Like it was not something that was introduced but always there. And so like I feel like I've kind of grown up in this world knowing that all of this type of information can and is being collected on me. And so like I'm still gonna like live the same way, but I just like it just is what it is, in like a kind of sad way.
Yeah, there's sort of sagging. You know, it's not. You're clearly not comfortable with it because if you listen to people, if you stop talking for a second while people are making the listen, there's like all kinds of awkward laughter that happens throughout the whole time. There's something about this which is like, oh, this doesn't feel good. Like any individual category can make you not feel that great. Like, do you really want MIT's IT department to be able to track where everyone can go? Like, that seems like it could go awry. And then just like the whole volume in aggregate, you realize like how much school. You can make a very similar list for K-12 schools as well. You can probably guess the places in which things are not exactly the same, but. And the data collection that people can do can be really influenced by policy. You know, the states have different rules about how attendance is connected to funding. Who's there on a particular day, who's there for what periods of time. You can imagine that you want to make sure that if a kid moves schools 3 times in a school year, that not all 3 of those schools get like a full student's tuition worth of, a student per pupil expenditure. But there are states that, part of the reason why they issue ID cards to students and track their entrance and things like that is to pay really close attention to that attendance data, just for that particular policy purpose. Was there another?
Yeah, I mean, adding on to like it being not surprising, I would say like a lot of the information that like they took while we were here, like our current residence or laundry and stuff like that, I feel like it's kind of like much more unsurprising just because like it is something that is like novel when you come to like a college or like an institution like this where it's like, oh wow, like they really do have this information. But I think what's kind of a little crazy is how much of this information they have before you even get here.
So yeah, for applicants, for people who are admitted into the school and things like that, yeah, there's a lot that you need to tell MIT for them to be able to come here and get here. There's a lot that you need to be able to, you know, to get in again these days you have to take the SAT, which means you are required to give a bunch of information to the College Board. And you also are in the process of doing that. You're probably asked to opt in to a bunch of things. I had a master's student, I can't remember all the details now, but did their thesis on essentially the kinds of things that the College Board did with information that they got, which to some extent you could say something like if you opt into flowers.com or something like that, you're like, man, I really want good information about what flowers are available, and then flowers.com sells your data. You're like, well, that's maybe that's a terrible system to exist in, but flowers.com did ask me if I wanted to give them my data, and I did agree to let them do anything with it. So and that was just my voluntary relationship. But you didn't really have a voluntary relationship with the College Board. You had no choice but to interact with the College Board to make it through this major life milestone. And so to the extent that the College Board does things with your information, that's a different relationship that you have with them than you have with flowers.com or pets.com or your own favorite thing. Okay, so we live in a world in which schools have enormous amounts of information about their individual students, that there's probably pretty big generational shifts in that experience. One of the main laws that governs these records is the FERPA, the Federal Education Records Protection Act, which I think was authored in the 1970s. We have a legal framework for supervising this data, which was just built in an entirely different era. FERPA refers to this thing called student records. At the time, it would have been very, very clear what a student record was. You would have gone to the registrar's office, and there would have been big file drawers, and you would have pulled out a file and been like, that is the student record. Are your clicker questions part of your student record? Are your Codio assignments? Are your Canvas entries? Are your Piazza form things? Are those part of your student records? There's much less clarity over those things than one might think. The term toxic has a kind of negative connotation, but I borrowed it from a security researcher named Bruce Shire, and part of his argument was that toxic things are powerful. Chemotherapies are toxic, and they save your life. They're great. Sometimes it's really good to interact with powerful toxic things, but toxic things are also dangerous. In particular, I think most of us have an inclination that when something is toxic, you should not leave it lying around for a long period of time. That was kind of the heart of Bruce's argument, was that companies were making a big mistake by having a very capacious approach to the collection and storage of data. That actually what you should be doing is just taking the data you need and getting rid of the rest of it, because it's a toxic asset to have lying around. The more you have it lying around, the more you're vulnerable to breaches, to other kinds of actors doing various nefarious things with that data. If you're an educational researcher, what kinds of thoughts might you have when you see this giant list of the data that schools collect about people?
Maybe honestly the first thing that kind of came to my mind was excitement, in the sense of if you're forming any type of research and trying to study how anything about a person can affect whatever you're studying. If you have all of this data, then there's really no limit to what you're able to kind of research.
This was an article from today, 2 days ago. I'm going to give you a couple of cutting edge things. Middle schools in Norway banned smartphones. The benefits were dramatic, a study shows. A study published earlier this year from a Norwegian doctoral student, where there were hundreds of schools across Norway that in various ways banned smartphones. Some of the outcomes they look at are student outcomes like learning, but also mental health. I show that banning smartphones significantly decreases the healthcare take-up for psychological symptoms and diseases among girls. Post-ban bullying among both genders decreases. Girls' GPA improves and their likelihood of attending an academic high school track increases. These effects are larger from girls from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So in Norway, they have vast information about students. Here are some things that you need to know to make this study work. You need to know all the students' grades. You need to know where all the students go to college. You need to know whenever the students visit the Norwegian healthcare system and what kinds of requests they're making from the Norwegian healthcare system. And you need to have them every year take a well-being survey that includes a bunch of questions about bullying. Like, that's a lot of information for the state to collect about all these students. But it certainly seems to me like a pretty pro-social thing to be able to say, hey, if we look at the schools that ban smartphones in middle school versus the ones that don't, there seem to be all of these health outcomes, and we can even actually say that the health, it's not just academic outcomes, it's also health outcomes, although the health outcomes are probably related in some way to the academic outcomes. But it's particularly for girls, and it's particularly for students in low socioeconomic environments. Like, that seems like pretty useful stuff to know. And so that is the kind of trade-off that people would face as they're going back and forth between, these, like, the massive data that we collect about students is also what lets us do pretty sophisticated, complicated research about those students to be able to make claims about how well they're doing in various parts of their lives. Toxic power of data and experiment. All right, I'll tell you about at least a couple of other things. There was a study that you read about in the chapter last night. This is a headline that came out. It was in 2018. There's a headline that came out about it. Pearson tested social psychological messages in learning software with mixed results. Did we talk about mindset in this class? Maybe we did briefly. Growth mindset and fixed mindset? Something, anyway, you're probably all familiar with it because teachers talk about it all the time. But there were, or education researchers, other folks. There are some social psychologists who have identified two kinds of mindsets that people often have towards learning or other kinds of things. One is a fixed mindset, which generally says, like, some people are smart and some people are not smart. And a growth mindset suggests that people have fluid intelligence and you can make yourself more intelligent in other kinds of things. Seems to be a pretty good idea to help young people adopt the latter mindset rather than the former mindset. Better to have them have a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset. Exactly how much it matters is a subject of enormous debate. There were a number of early studies that suggested it could matter quite enormously to all kinds of people, and some of the more recent larger studies suggest that, like, the best things that we can do, that we know how to do to improve growth mindset, only help some students and maybe only help them a little bit, like a lot of things that we study. So Pearson offers all kinds of software products, and I think this was a line of computer science software products, and so you do a bunch of programming exercises of multiple choice questions or things like that. And the thing that they decided to add was not just right or wrong messages, but randomized, some people getting growth mindset messages and some people not getting growth mindset messages. So I won't get this exactly right, but the example of a growth mindset message, might be something like, that's not right, but keep trying and you can learn more, or other things to suggest that if you keep working at this, you'll get better. What seems good about implementing that kind of intervention in a system like this, and what seems problematic about implementing an intervention in a system like this?
Well, problematic is that the control group is essentially, like, not necessarily being hurt, but not benefiting at all. And like if you're saying that a growth mindset really does help people, choosing to essentially not help them by putting them in the control group.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Pearson goes and reads a bunch of research about growth mindset, and they're like, hey, this growth mindset stuff seems to work sometimes. But they don't decide to just add it to their product. They add it to their product in this kind of experimental paradigm where some people get it and some people don't. And so people in the same class are going to have a different experience. So Dana proposes that one problem with that is that the people who get the experimental intervention might benefit in the way that people in the control group don't? What are some other problems that kind of potentially could show up with this?
I guess you have to take into account like who's in the control group and who's in the experimental group. How good of a job do they do at filtering out their students to make sure it's roughly equal in terms of like socioeconomic background, your prior experience with the subject, etc.
That's good. So I would say under most circumstances, especially in these kinds of digital systems, we can be really good at randomization. You could imagine that if you're like randomizing across whole schools or something like that, there might be people who are like, well, I don't want my school to do it, or you put me in a control group, but I just want to get the intervention anyway, or something like that. These kind of digital systems can be like very strict about the implementation of randomization, and you can be pretty sure that there's not going to be any kind of bias in delivery. I mean, you can imagine ways for bias to show up, but for the most part, it's going to be some, there's going to be some computer code which is like, if exercise 4, like assign someone a 0 or 1, control is 0, experiment is 1, and especially if you have hundreds or thousands of people who are participating in the experiment, you can be pretty sure that those two groups are the same. Not only that, but you can also verify that they're the same if you collect all this information about them going into it. So these things are going to be pretty good at that.
Well, I don't know if there was any consent given, but like from what I can gather is that this was just done without the students' knowledge.
Yes.
And so it's like, I wouldn't necessarily like it if I like came out of MIT graduating and then someone's like, okay, here's a paper of like what we analyzed during their 4 years here. I'm like, I don't necessarily want to know that people have been like watching my like every move and analyzing like certain things about me psychologically.
Why not?
It feels a little creepy.
Feels
like
good.
You're being watched, right?
Good. Feels a little creepy. Feels
Without
like
any
you're being
consent,
watched.
I can see why this is like.
Good. Other observations that people have?
Also, calling it like a social psychological message kind of makes it feel like the experimental group's being like propagandized or something like that. And so it's like, oh, they're being experimented with these different messaging
with
to make
these
their
social
brain think
psychological
different things.
messages.
Yeah, it's like it seems like that specific verbiage can like be kind of uncomfortable for people to accept as something that is potentially beneficial.
Good, yeah. So the reason why people are doing the social psychological messaging is because maybe it works. Actually, and it's not. And in this particular case, it's not just like, hey, we got kind of a hunch this works. These are like, well, actually, at this point, there was maybe like a decade of research that was totally plausibly suggesting that this could genuinely help students learn and improve their life outcomes and other kinds of things like that. And the way you do that is through through a social psychological intervention. Although it's not clear to me what in schools is not social psychological.
I was gonna say another thing, that as much as like we need the two populations to be like just as representative, are the experimental groups even representative of the general population? Like you have to imagine that people aren't being forced to participate in these things, or maybe if they are, like the schools that they chose, are they actually representative of the entire population? So, because like there obviously are studies where they get like outstanding results, but then the population used is not representative of the general population. So then once they apply those, it doesn't actually work.
Yeah, good. And to some extent, you might think that organizations like Pearson would have an advantage over much smaller companies, because if you have products that are adopted very, very widely across the country in lots of different contexts, you might, for practical purposes, say, like, let's just pick these handful of schools to be able to test things in, but you could say, like, we're going to pick these handful of schools because like these are particularly representative schools, or there might be systems that are adopted and laid out in such a way that you say, like, well, let's just pick 1% of all students in any of the schools who are using our system to get participate in this randomized study or something like that.
I feel like we talked a lot about like all of the things that go into using like a software program, because obviously that then entails that you have something to run the software program on. So anything online already comes with its own set of like biases and like things that affect the types of people that are using it.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair.
Also, another thing that I just realized in what Dana said was the population that they're testing this on is in college, so they've already probably developed a mindset, and also they are in college. Like they probably have already a good enough mindset that got them to college.
Yep. Although, I mean, and well, one thing that I really love about this study, which I think, so I wrote some after this article came out. I wrote a bunch of things which basically said I think this is a pretty unfair article. Here, I'll give you the case for why I think what Pearson did here is admirable and needs to be done more, although you don't have to agree with me. So number one, generally speaking, there's a body of research that suggests these things are a good idea. We don't know, however, are they a good idea in this particular product for this particular population? So I think it makes more sense to run an experiment in this particular product for this particular population to test the thing rather than just roll it out. I mean, this is an important sort of counterfactual. If Pearson had simply added these messages to everyone in the product, there never would have been an article about it. Nobody would have ever written, encouraging messages show up in software product is like not an article that even the education press is going to populate. Number two, like another counterfactual, there is no non-social psychological response to like every mark your teacher has ever put on your paper to indicate whether you're right or wrong is a social psychological message. If you go on edX and get something right, you're going to get a green check. If you're going to get something wrong, you're going to get a red X. Like that is a set of messaging. If you've ever had none of us would say that teachers who say, try harder, or that was great, I'm really proud of you. Like no one would be like, Miss Jenkins, stop manipulating my children. Like, no, that's like exactly what we want them to do. Some people are concerned about consent. People who go to school do not consent to their learning experiences. One of the things that we do as a state is say, like, you must learn stuff. And in fact, you must learn stuff that the state just requires you to learn. You don't get, these people didn't get to decide which Pearson product or which computer science project they chose. Why should they get to decide whether or not they get an experimental version or a control version? And in fact, the US government, for the most part, agrees with this principle. So there's a rule called the Common Rule, which dictates how research can be conducted. There's a bunch of policy guidance that's associated with that, and there's some categories of research that are exempt. The first category of research that's exempt is research about typical educational practices. If you're studying the kinds of ways people teach and learn in the classroom, you are not held to the same standard if you're doing pharmaceutical research or something like that. There are some exceptions, like if you're doing things that you could reasonably believe in advance might harm people, then you're not exempted in the same way, although you can still conceivably do the research. Another thing that's important about the study is that people talk about the potential benefits of an experiment, but experiments can also harm people. Like it could be that even if on average this growth messaging was great and worked in lots of studies, it could be that like in this particular context or other kinds of things, it made things worse. And we should probably make sure that when we introduce things in the classroom, we make things worse. How many people would have been concerned, let's say that in 2017, they had everyone use one Pearson product, maybe that doesn't have any growth messaging, and in 2018, everyone used a Pearson product that had the messaging associated with it. Do you think that would have raised people's concern or felt creepy? Like, why not? Why does that feel okay? You're like, wait a minute, it's the exact same thing.
I think there's this idea of, like, potential discrimination. Like, hey, why can't I be part of that? Like, it's either everybody or nobody.
But the more an intervention is particularly powerful, the more you're like, it feels kind of like if, control group like gets this intervention and gets an average grade of 89. An experimental group, gets the intervention and they have an average grade of 89.5. Like there's something that seems unfair about that. Although again, like, if in 2018 we give you a software product that you get an average grade of an 89, and then the following year we give you a software product with an average grade of 89.5, like your birth year was pretty random too. And so there's something about that. I mean, the case I want to make is that here's another way to think about it. Most people would be appalled by an education system that didn't have variation. Like my hunch is all of you believe that variation is an essential part of educational systems. Like you believe that your teachers, your textbook publishers, your software developers should be trying to improve their products. They should be trying to improve their instruction. They should be trying to improve their lesson plans. The only way you do that is through variation. You teach one lesson plan one year, you teach a different lesson plan the next year. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. My hunch is you all are totally comfortable with the idea that some of that variation will be bad, and that most of it on average will be good. The main thing that randomized trials like this do is they take that variation and they make it systematic so we can learn from it. If we do one thing in 2017 and a different thing in 2018, it's actually much, much harder to figure out if the different thing worked or not. Because all the people in 2017 might be in some systematic way different from the people in 2018. The best way to be sure that the difference between two groups is just because of the thing we're intervening about is a randomized trial. That is the magic of randomized trial. So they are everyone in the education system believes in variation. We all want things to improve. It's actually not that hard to convince people that the best way to systematically vary things is through randomization. And almost all of us find that randomization creepy. Like even if you sort of explain all it, you're like, it still doesn't feel right. Still doesn't feel. There's been some cool studies I've done in the past. It shows up in healthcare, shows up in other kinds of things like, you ask patients like, do you want an unproven treatment that might work better? And they'll be like, well, yeah, maybe. Do you want to be randomized to an unproven treatment that might work better? No, definitely. It's like it's the same thing, except we can learn from the randomization.
My question is, in this case, like, how are these different from, like, when companies release betas that some people get and some people don't?
Oh, every time you interact with a software product, every time you interact with a web-based software product, there is a reasonable chance you're participating in an experiment just like this. The numbers won't be right. 1 out of every 100 times you go to Amazon, the buy button is going to be green instead of blue. And someone is doing a test to figure out whether or not you pushing the green button is better. 1 out of every 100 times or 1,000 times or 10 times you go to Google, they're going to give you some variation of the search algorithm to see if you're happier or you linger longer or you're more likely to click ads on we interact every day with software platforms that are collecting vast amounts of information on us and conducting experiments on us all the time. Though the reason why those companies use those two approaches is because they are enormously powerful at improving products. The reason why just about any query you have, you go into Google and ask it a question and it tells you an accurate answer that's relevant to the question you asked is because they have conducted billions of experiments on millions or billions of people all throughout the last 20, 25 years that they've been operating. It is an essential part of our software infrastructure. Does the idea that you are participating in experiments all the time when you go Amazon shopping, does that have the same level of creepiness to you? For some reason, it's like, yeah, Jeff Bezos, do whatever you want, but we feel differently about Pearson for some reason.
I have a question about beyond the is this creepy or not creepy question, but if I have decided to buy a product, I'm paying to use Amazon or I'm paying to use Pearson, and with that is the assumption that I understand the thing I am buying because you pitched it to me in a certain way and I will get it. So then how does the question of are you allowed or not allowed to do this go from there?
And it would be a huge difference from historical educational curriculum material purchases. Like it used to be, like I bought, Houghton Mifflin Biology 8th edition, and I just know exactly what's in 8th edition. Like, and in fact, the salesperson's going to come back when 9th edition is going to come out, and they're going to be like, here's what's different about 9th edition, why you could buy it. And I might be like, no, I don't like what you did in 9th edition. I'm going to switch to a different company's products because these improvements are not improvements. Under what circumstances should companies be able to dynamically improve their educational products? What kind of information should they make accessible about that? Should they tell families? Should they tell educators? Should they tell, people could come up with different answers to these questions. I think actually publishing a bunch of that information is probably enormously important, but not to parents and teachers and educators. Parents and teachers and educators have no time to be like tracking how your Pearson computer science practice problems are changing. There are specialized advocates across the country who focus on education, who focus on student privacy or other kinds of things, who actually would have the time and expertise to follow those audit records. But if we started sending home a notice to parents every time a company who used one of their products was conducting an experiment, people it would just be it would be the terms and service conditions of your presumably too, by the way, it's very unlikely that when whatever school bought this Pearson product, presumably that their lawyers are competent and they made them sign a purchase and sale agreement that included these kinds of conditions in them. Although it's also the case that the researchers who did this thing didn't sit down with these schools and are like, let me tell you what we're doing in the next phase so that they might, I think in this case they didn't give them much indication.
Would it be like I guess back to the conversation of if it's creepy or not, do you think it might have anything to do with the illusion of choice that you're given? For example, if you're on Amazon or something, you can, or if you're on an app, you have the choice sometimes not to update the app and just stay on the previous setting. Or if you have something like Amazon, you can not use Amazon, or you're perceiving it as you're choosing to opt into that. While in a situation where you have to use a certain technology in school, you could argue that the student doesn't have a choice to opt out of this if they
and you could see that choice operating at different levels. So a grade school student has zero choice about whether or not to go to grade school. Every college student chose to go to college. Now, sort of once you've chosen to go to college, it doesn't feel like that should mean you have to accept everything that comes along with college. Although again, you don't you could choose some majors over other majors based on the technology. You could choose some classes over classes. The moment recently in which some of this most came into focus was when schools started requiring students to adopt proctoring software. Probably none of you have any of you ever taken a remotely proctored test at MIT? Where did you take a remotely proctored test at MIT?
I believe there was the AAC during my freshman starting year. They used some weird proctoring software for that.
Where you had to take your webcam or take your laptop or webcam, show the rest of your room, all these kinds of things.
Yeah, essentially.
Good. There are a number of cases where, for instance, universities implemented this kind of proctoring software mid-semester. And in fact, implemented it mid-semester and required students to pay for it. That you can imagine that as a set of circumstances which most draws the ire of people, because I've already committed to this college, I've already committed to this course, now you're making me essentially install spyware on my machine, and then I don't know, have some random person see what my dorm room looks like and other kinds of things, or my bedroom. These sort of things seem creepy. Arguably, maybe they're less creepy the more that they're disclosed to people over time. Although I also use the phrase illusion of choice, because in fact, for lots of things, for instance, there are no cell service companies that compete on the basis of not selling your location data. Like, it is not really a choice to not have a mobile phone anymore in society. And so you're not really, you know, in theory that's a choice, but it's not really one. You know, going to college, like for some people, it's not really a choice. Like you're gonna have to go to a choice to have the life that you want and things like that. But I do think K-12 students in particular, now another sort of unusual feature of this is that, and it goes back to this sort of data collection, you know, many K-12 students across the country are mandated to create a Google account. And then Google has reams of data about all these kinds of things that they do with that data. You know, and there might be various ways that, again, you know, so to what extent these things are legitimate or not, it's probably much less of a debate these days, but definitely when schools were first adopting Google for Education, it was not uncommon to hear that school boards had really vigorous complaints from parents, and oftentimes the most vigorous complaints came from parents who worked in the software industry. Like, I know who these people are. I work for these companies. How are you going to make my kid do these kinds of things? Let's talk about another one of these cases. So another story that you read about was InBloom in 2013. So the Gates Foundation, along with a number of other organizations, Wireless Generation, some other people, sort of observed, like, man, here's a weird thing. Companies who serve schools have tons of data about students, and sort of the only way we can make this system work, or the way the system currently works, is like some company goes to a school district and says, we'll operate this service for you, but here's all the data we need. And the schools are like, yeah, okay, deal. And if you make enough of those kinds of arrangements, I mean, another exercise we could do here is like make a list of all of the educational software products that you've ever used in schools. And you all could probably come up with lists of like dozens or more software products that you've encountered in some kind of way. Those are all people that have some kind of data about you somewhere. That seems like a terrible infrastructure. Like, you require people to go to schools. The schools make contracts with third parties to provide services, and all those third parties end up with sort of shards of data. So the idea of InBloom was, let's concentrate all of the data about students in one nonprofit organization. It'd be something along the lines of trying to generate the kind of data set that the Norwegian study that I just showed you would require. Like, let's get all their student records, let's get all their app usage, let's get all those kinds of things, and have a nonprofit entity hold on to that data. And in particular, let's make it so that instead of companies making arrangements with individual school districts to get access to the data they need, they just get in touch with this nonprofit. Now, what could potentially be good about having a nonprofit intermediary between schools and third parties that want to provide services to schools but require data to do it?
I think public perception is that nonprofits are a lot more trustworthy than for-profit companies, so people won't get as freaked out about it.
Yeah, good. So do you want like Pearson to have all of this data, or do you want, you know, InBloom, funded by a consortium of state departments of it? I mean, it was funded by the Gates Foundation, but like sponsored by a set of state departments of education to have this data. What else?
I had a question.
Yeah.
Like how it functions. So like if they have the data, and then like a company or some kind of researcher is trying to access it, do they have final say on like how it's being used, or do they then go back to the schools?
So InBloom failed, and we can talk about why it failed. So you don't have to worry about it existing. Although I'll show you a new thing that showed up this past week, which is remarkably similar. But I think some of the key value proposition was that the companies would go to InBloom and get just the data they need. What do you think InBloom would potentially be better at than schools might be?
Raw data processing.
Good. So first of all, they're just like, if your job is not to teach kindergarten and Mandarin, but like just to process student data, you're probably going to be better at processing student data than this organization that has to like have a field hockey team and run buses and other kinds of things like that.
think at least security is better too, if that's your main focus.
Why would there are 13,000 school districts in the United States of widely varying capacities and all kinds of IT things? It seems like an organization that is like just focused on IT things is going to be like, we don't even, like, in a lot of ways, if you have a society where a school has to be good at IT things, you may not be organizing that society correctly. And so you can, if you go to other countries, during the pandemic, like we had schools provision laptops and hotspots to students. Insane. There's no reason to think schools should be any good at that. Like there should be other institutions in society that are good at IT procurement. Like it shouldn't be your local. I mean, sometimes I would compare it to people like, in the 19th century when we decided that every household in the United States should get, or in the 20th century we decided every household in the United States should get electricity. We didn't go to the local school principal and be like, so how are you going to run wires up the holler? We invented the TVA and other kinds of organizations that was really good at electrification, so that the schools didn't have to be good at electrification. Like electrification is closer to provisioning broadband and laptops than it is to other kinds of educational things. All right, so these institutions could conceivably develop a whole bunch of expertise around data, around privacy, things like that. Another thing that they could probably get pretty good at doing is only giving providers the exact data they need. So schools have a tough time vetting like all of the data that they're making available to all their different providers, and so presumably they make arrangements and people just collect whatever. If there's a sort of intermediary in that collection process, you could imagine that InBloom could be pretty good at being like, yeah, Canvas, you just asked us for these 14 things, but I'm pretty sure to operate your system you need these 6. So why don't you start with these 6 and see how you do from there. And they might be able to do all kinds of other, right now for Canvas to operate, it needs to have, your actual email address and other kinds of things like that. You could imagine building all kinds of intermediary layers that only hashed identifiers are passing on to these third parties, and InBloom collects all this. InBloom fails almost immediately. Well, here's a few things that were written about it when it started. Nonprofit InBloom offers an internet database service that allows schools to store, track, and analyze data on school children. If you think about it, that information is more than just test scores. It's whether kids receive free lunch, a telling indicator of the family's finances, the time the school got into a fight in the schoolyard. It could be a child's prescription medicine. The upshot of storing all that data in one location is it can be used to tailor curricula to each child. If Johnny's data suggests he's a tactile learner, which is not true, there are no learning styles, and he's failing math, InBloom's analytic action might suggest a particular teaching approach. This is all about building personalized learning environments for kids. But as more school districts team up with InBloom, including New York, parents are becoming increasingly vocal critics of the data collection. This information, I have no idea what it is, I have no idea who's using it, and I have no idea for what purpose. So part of what the existence of InBloom did was to go to communities and be like, hey, you know what's happening right now? There's tons of data being collected about children. And we're going to put it all in one place. Like you can imagine that, for people like me, they're like, yeah, that's a great idea. We're totally going to be able to have all these benefits. But there's tons of data being collected about children, and it's all going to be put in one place is not actually, as it turns out, a very popular public pitch. InBloom CEO is quick to point out that the company isn't collecting data. It isn't collecting data the school districts don't already have. It's just providing a one-stop shop to make the data accessible and usable to teachers, although really a lot of what it was doing was making the data accessible and usable to third parties, which might then benefit teachers. Schools and districts collect a lot of data, but it's all over the place, Steinberger says. It's different systems are disconnected, and so as a result, this data is not usable. Can anybody think of all right, so that was a very serious problem. Schools are collecting tons of data, it's fragmented across all these services, all these kinds of things. And so, in a sense, there's constant ongoing privacy, either privacy risk, privacy violations, and not sensible ways to manage it. That's the problem that InBloom's trying to solve. Can anybody think of around 2013, major things that are happening in the United States related to people's perception of their data and security? You all are a little young for this now.
Is that when the Target?
Target, I think, is not that far away from that. So we start seeing some of the major data security breaches.
It's like Cambridge Analytica.
I think Cambridge Analytica is a little bit afterwards because that is around the 2016 election. Yeah, Snowden. This is the sort of Edward Snowden era of recognizing the federal government is collecting much more data about people than was previously thought. So in 2013, first of all, people are far less accustomed to surveillance than you all described yourself as accustomed to surveillance, and there had just been this major national revelation. Sort of an interesting thing about the In Bloom story is, so eventually what happens is there were sort of 11 states that signed on initially, and the hope was that like then 13 and 14 and 18 and 20, that eventually lots and lots of states would come on. Almost immediately states started withdrawing from it. In particular, in part because of the concentrated objection from local advocates, local advocacy groups, including like student privacy groups that were just formed around this time. New York was like one of the lead ones. It was one of the last ones to fall out, but it also had one of the most sort of vociferous, determined community of student privacy advocates opting. You know, so. States started like one of the main outcomes of In Bloom was not its existence actually, but like a bunch of state laws about student privacy in part that would make it more difficult for things like In Bloom to exist. A common problem that shows up when trying to fix data and privacy problems, and I'm giving you an example from schools, but this is a thing that you could find in almost any in any other sector, like. The pre-In Bloom counterfactual is really, really bad. It is not a good system to like force kids to go to public schools and then have a bunch of third-party for-profit companies get their data from schools. The schools are bad at managing it. They don't have the expertise, all these kinds of things. However, by trying to fix the problem, In Bloom draws attention to the problem. You know, like, man, this data is such a mess and we're going to collect it all. Like in some, like there are all kinds of circumstances in which you like, if you draw attention to data and experiments, even if the sort of like, the status quo is really terrible, people are not going to be enthusiastic about the fix because nobody thinks day to day about the status quo, but they think really intensely about this crazy In Bloom thing that you're doing. Does that as an idea make sense? Like this, essentially, you know, there's all like, other studies come out along the lines of, hey, we've come up with this really good way to protect your privacy. Will you opt into it? People will be like, whoa, why would I have to protect my privacy? Why would I opt into this thing? It's dangerous. Like they would prefer the status quo where their privacy is not protected towards this thing in which you've raised their concerns about. So this is an organization that just came into life last week. It's called Safe Insights. It was funded by $90 million from the National Science Foundation. It is out of Rice University, out of the same people that developed OpenStax. We talked about OpenStax the other day. They're the company that creates free and open source textbooks for community college folks. They have, well, we have enough time. I'll show you the one, let's see if we can find the Safe Insights welcome video.
As a long-time college instructor, every day of my career has been dedicated to helping my students reach their academic goals. I'm always looking to better support their learning in ways that are proven to work best.
There's so much we have to understand about how people learn. Every mind is beautiful and special. That means we all learn in different ways. We all have our own definitions of what success looks like. If researchers are able to uncover new and better ways of learning, that will have a profound impact on how educators approach teaching. To do this, we need a way to securely connect with a wide variety of students as they study over time in real classrooms.
Student needs are changing. With more learning happening online, it gets harder and harder to understand what each student needs and how best to help them at the moment when they're really needed the most.
Education research is essential for advancing teaching and learning so that every student can succeed. We know that research-informed teaching works, but it's still too hard to conduct large-scale, reliable research and then apply the results in the classroom. Safe Insights brings together learning researchers, educators, schools, and colleges in a secure environment to get the answers we need while strongly protecting students and their interests.
Every student deserves a chance to succeed in the classroom and beyond.
Safe Insights will give researchers, educators, and students what they need to take learning to the next level.
And as educators, we will benefit from better research from Safe Insights to effectively help all our students.
It is a little dramatic for like a database, but I mean I don't know, I like databases. Okay, what are your first instincts, having spent a whole bunch of time, having spent an hour and 20 minutes talking about the toxic power of data and experiments, and how do you think like a typical American parent or a typical American college student would react to that video?
I think it would change like based on different generations, because I think our generation who is now like using TikTok, when we openly know like they use our data and like listen to us, is completely different from like our parents who are like, oh my god, like don't have a profile picture, don't do this and that. So I think our generation will be way more accepting of this, and I think as like in like 10, 20 years down the line, I think people and parents will be so accustomed to their children's data just being like whatever.
Good. So so conceivably, even In Bloom launched today might have had a very different experience than In Bloom launched in 2013, not because of anything different that they did, but because of the context that they operate in. I think there's evidence of that. I was just talking to somebody who runs a video repository for child development studies, and one of their conditions is that the videos can only be used for non-commercial purposes. And I was like, why did you do that? And we're like, well, we made it 10 years ago and people were really worried about stuff, and that sort of helped calm them down. But if we did it again today, I don't think the same level of concern exists, not only among people generally, but like institutionally as well. What do you say, Courtney?
I think it was really smart that they've attached themselves to Reich, because I think especially like our parents' generation, maybe less so now, there's a lot of goodwill given to universities. And so like if In Bloom came out today and it was like, oh, in partnership with MIT, I do think people would have received it a lot differently, and like people have a lot of trust that like, oh, if it's connected to Reich, how bad could it really be?
Yeah, and I would say the Gates Foundation related conspiracy theories were not quite as strong in 2013, but like the Gates Foundation is not a trusted organization in the same way that I think Rice University, universities in general, like state schools are still some of the most trusted institutions in society.
I think like maybe actually a little connected to that trustworthiness, I think, is that if you say like, oh my god, look, all your data is in one place, like to someone who finds like education research and things like that really important and is like much more aware of like how that might help, that might sound good, but I think to the average person, first and foremost, what's gonna pop out when you just tell them, oh, we have everything in one place and we promise it's safe, is like, one, like, you're not giving me any information about how you're keeping the data safe, and two, like, I think, like, it's always been, like, set up, like, don't put all your data in one place. Yeah. So it's like, well, why are you, like, saying this is a good thing? Because then this means that, like, someone can have all my data, as opposed to, like, let's say if it is split up, even if it's there, I can be like, okay, like, my teacher might have this piece of data on me, but they might not have this other piece of data.
And actually, probably the main technical, I mean, there are probably a bunch, and we don't know exactly where they'll be then, but one of the earliest proposed technical innovations of Safe Insights is not to bring all of the data together. So it doesn't propose that all of it gets collected. One of the main things that they want to be able to do is to be able to conduct research queries across data without having people have to directly access those data. So there's a whole field of study called things like differential privacy and stuff like that, which basically says, how do I tell you the kinds of things that are in a data set, let you run a query over that data set, but never actually encounter that data set. And in this kind of environment, there might be, how would you run a query that connects people's student behavior in a learning platform with their registrar information, with their state test scores, without having to like make one giant data set out of all those things, but instead to like have the query just, run over the data it needs, like have the people who own that data still hold on to that data, but have the results of that query go to technology developers, researchers, things like that, without having to have them collect all of the data. So in some ways, it's like explicitly trying to be the opposite of in Bloom. Like, don't bring all the data in one place, like try to get the benefits of aggregated data without having to share it with either a trusted third party or everyone or something like that.
I was just gonna say, I feel like you kind of answered it like right there with what you were saying, but like in your opinion, do you think like the people who are creating this new, the safe insights, do you think they like really understood what went wrong in Bloom, and do you think like ultimately does it lead back to
Boy, it sure it sure sounds like it to me, like powerful privacy preserving learning research. So like the very first concept they want to ingrain in your head is safe. The second concept that I think they're doing rhetorically is leaning into insight rather than data. So I think if you asked people what InBloom was, they would have described it as some kind of data repository. My hunch is that the Safe Insights people are going to describe themselves as an insight generator, as a research producer. Now, it's the exact same thing, right? Because in order to get the insights, you have to have the data somewhere. And InBloom's purpose was never just to like hoard data. It was to make learning better for kids. But I think there are, I guarantee you that all of the people, many of the people who worked on Safe Insights have done plenty of studying of what went wrong with InBloom, and are designing this enterprise, so that it's with a trusted university. It's founded by the National Science Foundation, which I assume also has very high trust. But all of this language, it definitely strikes me as like people who read up on the InBloom case study and are trying a different tack.
I think another good thing that they did was associate themselves with a previous product that was successful, which was OpenStax, which in itself, OpenStax, I mean, they are open, open source, like free to use textbooks. And that in itself has proven to be like, okay, we are transparent, quite literally transparent about what we're doing. And we've already provided a useful, successful product for the masses.
And they have a ton, they have 40 partners, 39 collaborating institutions. Of their collaborating institutions, 77% are minority-serving institutions. So they're trying to start from the beginning, saying, we're not just going to do this to improve Columbia and Rice. We're going to do this to improve, lots of different kinds of organizations. It also, instead of being a consortium of states, it's really mostly a consortium of digital learning platforms. Probably matters to there's clear emphasis on college. I'm like Assessments doesn't do anything for college, so they definitely have some things that are not. I'm not sure it's literally true, but Assessments, 99% of what they do is serve K-12 students. But I think it maybe does make a difference to in like college students are adults. College students opt in to go to college. The state doesn't force anyone to go to college, and so you're just operating in a maybe illusory choice, but you're operating in a space where you feel like people have more agency to begin with to operate. Unlike InBloom, which said these 11 states are the organization, like these state education agencies are sort of the key people we're interacting with. They don't mention higher education accreditors or state boards of higher education. They basically have left government out, except for the National Science Foundation, of this development. Maybe people are more trustworthy of these organizations, or maybe they're just even if they're not more trustworthy of these organizations, people are kind of drawn. Critics are potentially drawn to things like New York State approves X, versus this kind of arbitrary group of universities, some of whom might be in New York, approve X. So it'll be super interesting to watch. This is the grant that they got was from the same. $90 million is probably the largest federal grant to an educational research project ever, although there's a couple of educational research projects that if you totaled up all the grants they got over a period of time, might be sort of at least within that ballpark. it came from the same grant funding that supports like telescopes and ecological plots. It's called mid-scale research infrastructure, things that are like, where no one university can build like a giant radio telescope, and you don't want one university to. You want to build a thing that like the entire field of astronomy can all collectively use together. And so this grant stream is meant to build enormous things that everyone can use together. So it'll be sort of interesting to see what they do in the decades ahead. But I think in some ways, especially coming about 10 years after the collapse of InBloom, to me it's sort of neat. People still have optimism that if you pull together a bunch of student learning data and data about students, and you conduct a bunch of experiments, you can build things that help them learn better. But there are enormous real risks, and there may be even more enormous kind of reputational risks that go into this work. One thing that I've tried to communicate, which it sounds like these folks are adopting to many different groups, is like, because I'm basically part of the community of people that would like to collect lots of data about students, and I've done, I've handled data files that have like way more information about people than I feel comfortable having access to. And part of the job is doing things responsibly, but the other part of the job is like constantly talking to the public about what we're doing. The only way people will not be creeped out by doing experiments is if A, we conduct a bunch of experiments that meaningfully improve learning. A huge challenge that education has is like, we don't have the equivalent of the Human Genome Project. We don't have a thing that you could point to being like, well, yeah, we took a whole lot of your data, but like, we're curing cancer here, people. If Safe Insights came up with something that made students learn math 33% faster, it would totally change the way people think about the collection of data. So your cost-benefit data would transform quite dramatically. But even in the absence of that, like, it's incredibly important to be engaged with these student privacy groups, engaged with families, trying to explain to people like, there's always going to be variation in education. What we probably could benefit the most from is systematic variation, where we can tell which parts of the variation work and which parts don't. And the only way that we can do that is through some of these approaches that include data collection and randomization and things like that.
You just like made the statement that like Safe Insights comes up with like some solution. So is Safe Insights kind of like that? Is it like a third party that is?
It is less of a third party than InBloom. Yes, clearly some of the things that Rice is going to do with this money is build systems and study OpenStacks with it. Much more so than InBloom. InBloom didn't have InBloom never, to my knowledge, never had a list of partners that looked like this list. They never said from the beginning, oh, look, like Kahoot and Google Classroom and all these other people are our lead partners and are going to use this to figure out stuff. They like really saw themselves solving an infrastructural problem more that, I think these folks are positioning themselves more like, first, we're going to have a set of tech products that improve learning through better research practices, including better forms of data management and data sharing and data privacy. But if it's a real infrastructure product, like part of what, I'm sure Rich's goal is to say, we're going to develop these privacy protecting research enclaves, and we're going to develop them in an open source way that like whatever future ed tech companies come along are going to be able to benefit from this infrastructure. Like they're going to be able to do all the same kinds of things that OpenStacks is doing to conduct cool experimental research with lots of data while protecting people's privacy. Great. It's 2:25, so I should let you go. We'll come in on Wednesday, and you have a little bit of reading about implementation in schools, but mostly what you should be working on is getting some words on paper for your final project, and thinking a little bit about, a thing that we'll do probably by email this week, but maybe a bit in class on Wednesday, is I need you to sign up to either present on Monday or Wednesday. Maybe I'll send you something pretty soon that invites you to sign up for one of those two slots.